Hello everyone and welcome to Sparta. Today's guest is Alex Martinis Roe, who's currently in Melbourne. The title of her talk is, I'm going to read it out, The Practice of Relationships in Feminist, Decolonial and Queer Communities.
Yeah, so today we will have the Q&A session as usual, starting at 9:15. And you will find the link underneath the video or as a comment or in the video description below. So, hello, Alex. Nice to have you here.
Hi, Pia. Hi, Till. Thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to your series on storytelling. And yeah, it's great to take part in it. Thank you. Before I begin my talk, I want to make an acknowledgement of country, which is an important gesture to honor the unceded sovereignty of First Nations people and to make my relationship to the place that I'm currently in clear. So I acknowledge the Wurundjeri and also the Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm currently living and working on, and where I'm giving this talk from in Melbourne, in Australia. Theirs are among the oldest continuing human cultures on Earth, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region who welcomed me to their country and whom I began an important journey, which I'll recount towards the end of my talk. And I also pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging too. So Pia and Till, when they invited me to give this talk, asked me to share my thoughts on forms of coming together and collective action, which Pia said was relevant to think about in this time of isolation. And so in response, I'm going to talk about some historical feminist relational practices that I've found useful in fostering alliances and what I call solidarity in difference. So I discovered in my long-term research projects that practices that foster relational difference are actually indispensable. Although they can be kind of delicious and full of desire and bliss, they are not a luxury. They are a precondition for liberation politics and a politics of difference. And they underpin the kinds of alliances that are so important to overcoming the inaction that division causes, and thus making it possible to collectively resist the dominance of violent powers and cultures, which has become more urgent than ever, I guess. So I'll give some examples of how I've used storytelling as a structure to disseminate knowledge about these relational practices. And also the way that I'll talk about the way that I've actually used storytelling as a way to undertake these relational practices too. So I'll start with this project To Become Two. And as part of this research project, which included 6 film installations, which were shown in various different configurations, and it also included a series of workshops and public salons, and also a book. And yeah, as part of this project, I spent time with the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective, among other collectives. And the reason that I'm interested in this group is because of their emphasis on what they call the practice of relations. So in particular, I was interested in how they named a specific type of relationship between two women, affidamento, which became the organizing structure of their collective, and which proposes a political model that I think is very useful to forming alliances now across different positionalities. Teresa de Loretas translates affidamento as entrustment, and the collective describe it as a special kind of relationship between two women that exceeds the kinds of relationships found in the existing institutions of family, friendship, and work. And it involves a commitment to the other woman as a political partner. So in that partnership, the two engage in an intimate process of becoming each other's point of reference in their different endeavors. And through this together, they establish a kind of a different and female-determined structure of validation. And the way of doing this practice is to refer to and support one another in the different spheres of political practice that they each want to take part in, and thus giving each other authority in those different spaces. And they do that through this kind of full acknowledgement and support of the other's competences, achievements, and desires. So one of the examples that they use to describe affidamento is the relationship between Virginia Woolf and Vida Sackville-West. Virginia was an extraordinary experimental writer, whereas Vita was the writer of bestsellers. And they each use their different competences to support each other. For example, Vida published one of her best-selling books with Virginia's publishing house, the Hogarth Press, so that the Hogarth Press could then afford to publish more experimental titles. And Virginia gave Vita vital criticism that improved her writing, as she was a kind of, I guess, a superior writer. So what makes it a story of affidamento is the kind of long-term admiration, care, and love that they had for each other, which was based on their difference from each other. So I guess they each grew through the relationship to the other and their different strengths. So the practice of affidamento is very much about committing to other women and not instrumentalizing relationships with them. And I think you can kind of describe it as an ethical practice of love, where both women open themselves to each other, and in that act of entrustment, they're actually kind of inventing themselves through that relation. And it did come about because when they first sort of defined this relationship in the mid-70s and early 80s, in Milan, the women there still were primarily kind of denied a kind of a place in the public sphere. And so I guess this relationship of affidamento was about creating modes with which they could enter into a political space and use their different strengths in order to make space for each other in those different spheres. So I think perhaps one of the reasons that the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative acknowledged and developed this practice, and I say acknowledged because they say it's an ancient practice, one that has been, done forever by women. But I guess the difference is that they did it with commitment and with intentionality. But yeah, the reason they focused on that, I think, is because of the diversity of its members, of the group's members, which included women from different social classes, ages, sexualities, and in a few cases, ethnicities. And that was really very significant that, women from different social classes came together in the women's movement in Milan and in Italy more broadly. It really did transform usual social dynamics, and I think created relationships that otherwise wouldn't have existed. And the practice works on those differences as they are really embodied and lived by each member of the group. And and organizes the group rather than using blanket policies. So so I guess what's significant is that in each relationship, the practice generates female authority, which validates and thus enables both women to act in these political spheres that they desire to act in, and in ways that are liberating for both of them. And what's significant about these relationships of affidamento when taken as a political model is that collaboration and political alliance is not dependent upon a shared identity. Relations of affidamento are always one-on-one, and yet they form the bookstore group as an interlinked web. So rather than consensus, the collective entrusts members with authority according to their desire and competence, but because of the high degree of trust and intimacy in the group, everyone is very consultative with each other. So authority is kind of constantly shifting, and power is held collectively in that way. So I'll give an example, like in a consensus model, if there was one of the members of the group was running the bookshop that day, and someone came in and said, can I borrow 100 books? And I'll give them back in 2 months. She would have to go to a meeting and get everyone at that meeting to agree. But in their model, she has the authority to make that decision on her own. There's no protocol that says that she has to get permission from the others in order to make that choice. But the convention is that because she's so it has such strong and intense relationships with other members of the group that she would probably check in with one or two of them before making such an important decision, in order just to see whether they thought that she'd made the right choice. But I guess the reason that works in the group is because in those relationships of affidamento, the women are vulnerable to each other because their sense of self has been constructed through the relation. It means that they wouldn't want to abuse their power in the role that they've taken on, because So it's quite a different model to the consensus model, which had been up until the mid-70s the kind of main way that that the feminist movement in Italy had been organized. So the practice of giving and receiving authority means that you stay responsible to your political partner, and a care for them is a care for yourself. And the high degree of trust in affidamento and staying with the trouble and staying committed is what distinguishes it. And I see affidamento as a key political practice for future feminisms and for politically engaged communities of all kinds, because it enables collective projects and relationships to come about through and not despite difference, and in that way traverses the borders of identity politics. So the Two Become Two project involved research with this group, the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative, and 4 other related feminist communities in Europe and Australia over a number of years, between 2013 and 2017. And it was the process of coming to, I would describe the whole project as a kind of process of coming to know my own feminist formation, entering into a kind of direct and reciprocal and embodied relationship with the feminists that had shaped my position through reading their books. And specifically, I wanted to trace the social history of the theory of sexual difference, to understand the practices that it came from, and also the theory, how the theory was put into practice. Tracing its development by the French group Psychanalyse Politique in the late 60s and early 70s, and then its transfer to this group in Milan, and their elaboration of it into a model for collective politics, And then the way that this model and practices from Milan were taken up in Barcelona, and how in another simultaneous but different trajectory, the ideas and practices spread from Paris to Utrecht and then Sydney, and how these two communities in dialogue with one another developed so many of the key ideas of corporeal feminism and feminist new materialism and feminist posthumanism. So I thought, as a kind of to give like one little window into this, I would show the film that I made in Barcelona, which is called For the Joy of Being Together, They Didn't Have to Agree, partly because it's one of the shorter ones, and it also because it explores how important the practice of affidamento has been to the feminist movement in Barcelona on a really large scale, and how it has fostered solidarity among different feminist positions in a way that is, I guess, I would say really true to the theory, which actually was not practiced fully by the Italian and the French groups, who really became quite dogmatic and at odds with other feminist positions. So they're sort of, I think those two groups ended up in some ways betraying the politics of difference that they had in a way within their own groups invented, because they didn't practice that in relation to other groupings and other positions. And that's what happened in Barcelona. So I'll play that film now and say a little bit more about it afterwards.
Se reunían en departamentos como este y pasaban copias de textos feministas franceses entre ellas.
They go together in apartments like this one and they pass around photocopies of French feminist texts.
Sabían que había otros grupos, pero no tenían idea cuántos.
They knew there were other groups, but they didn't know how many of them.
Li vaig preguntar què era el que li havia alliberat més.
I asked her what was that liberated her the most.
Havia estat l'alegria d'estar amb altres dones. La llibertat d'inventar-se ella mateixa a la seva companyia.
Más tarde, ella encontró esta experiencia nombrada y afirmada en los escritos de un grupo de mujeres de Milán.
It was done here 11 centuries ago too. A group of women began this neighbourhood. Today there are many women's projects, nearby and even in this house, where 7 women live together today, each with her own apartment.
La editorial, ventas, eventos, todo se hacía aquí en el bar.
The editorial, the parties, the events, they all happen here in the bar.
Els grups secrets havien sortit a la llum i s'havien juntat.
The secret groups had come out and joined together.
La sal, la mar.
La sal, the sea.
Una de las mujeres que trabajaba aquí escribió.
One of the women that worked here, she wrote,
Voldria saber, un dia m'ho has d'explicar, per què la mar està sempre present en tu.
I would like to know, one day you have to tell me why the sea is always present in you.
Me lo habrás de explicar sin muchas palabras, pero enseguida.
You will have to explain to me without using many words, but quickly.
Porque cada día me gusta más navegar.
Because day by day, I like to sail more and more.
Una mujer me invitó a comer a su casa. Lo que era, ella me dijo que se había encontrado un libro pequeño mientras viajaba en Italia. Era escrito por una mujer de un grupo en Milán. Lo que era especial era la prioridad que se le daba a la práctica política en primera persona. Justo después de que regresaron, las mujeres de Milán vinieron a dar una plática. Justo después, el autor de aquel libro tan especial cruzó el cuarto para encontrarla en la audiencia. Ella no había dicho nada y tampoco habían sido presentadas. Era del mismo grupo, pero al final ella le dijo, no te lo puedo devolver, no puedo vivir sin él.
Ellas son parte de un grupo de la universidad de aquí.
They're part of a group at the university here.
El cual tiene un espacio donde las mujeres pueden estudiar otras mujeres.
And they have a space where women can study other women.
La mujer en la universidad hizo posible estudiar sin los requisitos usuales.
The woman at university made possible to study with the usual prerequisites.
Fue un lugar muy importante para las mujeres en el movimiento.
It became a very important place for the women in the movement.
Un lugar donde podrían determinar el conocimiento acerca de sí mismas.
A place where they could determine knowledge about themselves.
Las ideas que ellas encontraron en ese viaje por Italia se convirtieron en los fundamentos de ese trabajo.
So the ideas that were formed on that trip to Italy became the foundation of this work.
Una de las traductoras de la SAL me habló de la decisión que formó parte en el Consejo de Mujeres del gobierno local.
One of the translators of the SAL told me about the decision she was part of in the Women's Council at the local government.
Ellas necesitaban un presidente, pero rechazaron el nombre porque lo asociaban col poder jerárquico.
They needed a president, but they rejected the term because it was related to hierarchical power.
Ella em va dir, vam intentar obrir el significat d'aquest terme i vam veure que per a algunes també incloia la noció d'autoritat.
She told me they tried to open up the meaning of that word, and some of them felt it has a notion of authority too.
Aquesta noció d'autoritat venia de Milan.
This notion of authority came from Milan.
Ellas buscaban una palabra para describir lo que querían y luego llegaron al concepto de mentora, la persona que actúa como consejera o guía de otra.
They were looking for a word that expressed what they wanted, and they find mentor, which means the guide of another person.
Hoy, una de ellas es el alcalde de esta ciudad.
Estaba también en un grupo de práctica de relaciones. Fueron invitados a una conferencia para hablar de esto. Había una división en el grupo. Una de ellas dijo, yo veo que las tres que quieren intervenir tienen un deseo muy fuerte de hacerlo y yo creo que debemos de apoyar ese deseo. Esto era algo que querían hacer, así que llegaron a la decisión de que dictar las acciones de todos.
Since this was something they really wanted to do, they got to a conclusion that in order not to dictate everyone's actions,
porque esto sería intolerable para algunas,
because this would have been intolerable for some of them,
solo tres hablarían y el resto se sentaría con ellas en el escenario, pero en silencio.
Only the three of them would speak and the rest would be with them on stage, but they remained silent.
Això queda reflexat a la manera que els diferents grups aquí van quedar connectats.
This echoed in the way the groups here stay connected.
Se apoyaban entre ellas, pero eso no quería decir que estaban de acuerdo.
They supported each other, but this doesn't mean they always had to agree.
Hace casi 20 años, 3.000 de ellas se encontraron aquí.
Nearly 20 years ago, 3,000 met here.
¿Dónde nos encontraremos la próxima vez?
Where will we meet next time?
Yeah, so one of the women that I interviewed in my research for this film, the founder of Proleg Women's Bookshop in Barcelona, Ángeles Grases, was among those who explained to me that parties at bars like La Salle and the joy of the relationships with other women were what liberated her the most. So what's significant about this sentiment from the Spanish women is that objectively they had actually been the most oppressed of the women that I spent time with in this overall research project. And I think you could say that they were probably the most oppressed women in Western Europe. Before Franco's death in 1975, the beginning of which was also the beginning of the mass women's movement, Spanish women had really very little liberty. And for example, in order to, Ángeles told me that to purchase something from a shop, a woman had to show a signed slip of paper from her husband permitting her to buy it. And so given the conditions that they were under, winning the right to divorce, for example, was hugely important in the transformation of sexual politics in Spain. And yet Ángeles Grases still said that it was the relation to other women and the freedom to be herself in their company and, you know, having fun at the bar La Salle. That was the most transformational experience. And she said it was more important than being able to divorce her husband and live independently, which she did. So what was really special in Barcelona was the way that the different feminist groups relied on each other and were in solidarity with each other. And I really saw that happening at organizations like Cala Donna, this documentation center for the women's movement, but also a whole range of other groups. And I remember I went to one meeting at a nearby organization that was related to it, and sitting at the table there was like a delegate from a migrant women workers union. There was some young people from this group called Trans Alliance. There were some kind of older sexual difference feminists, and a sort of collection of people that in a lot of places is really rare to see, because they kind of come with really different positionalities, different discourses, different experiences. And I thought that was really, that was really remarkable and extraordinary that actually this practice of affidamento, which had been disseminated really widely in Barcelona from that women's studies center in the university, because people could go and study there without having already done a bachelor's degree. And it really kind of went out into the movement, into all different sectors of it. And people really used it as a way to traverse different groupings and different positionalities. And I think that that story that, even it's actually Ada Colau, who was the mayor of the city of Barcelona at the time when I was making the film, that even she had, taken on this position of the mentor, which had been designed with this relation of affidamento in mind, prior to kind of taking on her role as the mayor. So it had kind of transformed from being this kind of micro practice into something quite macro. And I think that's kind of, proved to me that this practice of relations is really indispensable for feminist politics, and doesn't really require that many resources. And that it does have this potential to create solidarity in a broad-based movement. where I said where micro-relational practices become macro. And just a comment on like my approach to the storytelling in that film, I decided to kind of set it up in this quite awkward way. I mean, you probably noticed that the narrators are not very good at narrating. And the reason is that they're not reading, they're actually live translating these texts that we kind of, that I wrote with their help as well. And they're translating it from English to Catalan, and then to Spanish, and then back to English, and so on. So it's like this kind of, I really wanted to foreground the kind of slippage in translation, this kind of foreground the labor that is involved in choosing to inherit a story that is not one that you lived yourself, partly to kind of position myself as an outsider, but also to show, I guess, the work that needs to be done by subsequent generations in order to understand the significance of what has gone before. I mean, and so I also wanted to kind of show this as something shared, like that these different people who had worked with me on the project as translators, a lot of them, helping me interview people in a language that I didn't speak, that they could kind of tell this story together. And then we also kind of took these archival images that, these kind of fragments that helped us tell the stories, and use them as this kind of, as something to reenact. So we're kind of visiting these same locations where events happened, and then using the photographs as like a kind of guide for how we could arrange ourselves in those spaces in order to undertake this storytelling work. And and it was, I think, really interesting to visit those spaces and kind of know that these really incredible revolutionary things had happened in them. And even if now their kind of use was quite banal, to feel that they had the potential for something great to happen there again. So I thought now I would talk a bit about the research I did in Sydney. I'll just switch back to the slideshow. And the research that I did in Sydney brought other insights into alliances. So in 2017, I completed the last of the history films in the Two Become Two project, and which is about the digestion of continental sexual difference feminism in Sydney in the 1970s and 80s. And it was about opening the very notion that there was a particular perspective. And this 3-channel installation proposes that the reason for the development of transdisciplinary feminist scholarship in Sydney in the 80s is a result of the early self-published translations of continental sexual difference philosophy, which was read by activist communities involved in a range of interlinked political movements, including feminism, gay liberation, Aboriginal rights, and radical trade unionism. And it involved filmmakers and laborers and students and theorists and artists, among others. And it really was kind of incredible how, really interesting, like, for example, Paul Foss, who was a science studies scholar, I think, I couldn't find any earlier one, the first translation of Lucy Regray's essay, That Sex Which Is Not One. And he was like a leading figure in the gay liberation movement. So he was kind of like a gay man translating Lucy Regray's That Sex Which Is Not One, with a kind of science studies interest in it. This is in the 70s. So that's really kind of fascinating how then, you know, people like that were publishing these translations just in these little gestetnet pamphlets and then distributing them, you know, at like women's shelters and stuff. So, you know, all sorts of people were reading them, like people in the university, but also in a whole lot of other contexts as well. So the film centers on the philosophy strike, which was an event that happened in 1973 at the University of Sydney after a proposal by two PhD candidates to teach a course called Philosophical Aspects of Feminist Thought, which would have been the first like women's studies or feminist course ever taught at the university. So the strike happened when that proposal was rejected by the academic board. And it was a huge big deal. It went on for like over a month and was like all over the newspapers, and it was a really big deal because so many students and so many lecturers were on strike. In the film, I focus on the alliance that formed between the students and the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation, which was a radical union. And in the film, it's implied that the success of the strike was in part because of the fact that the Builders Labourers Federation had imposed a green ban on Sydney University, which prevented building works from going ahead, and thus put kind of financial pressure on the university to meet the demands of the feminists. And I think that event was such an extraordinary image in my mind, these builders labourers in hard hats campaigning for feminist philosophy on the lawns of the university. And it really did it was a very significant event and set the stage, I think, among a range of other events like it, for a very special relationship between activist alliances and feminist philosophy in Sydney in the decade that followed. And I believe that it is the history of cross-issue activist solidarity that fostered the kind of transdisciplinary trajectory of feminist scholarship in Sydney, which now, you know, has become known as feminist new materialism or feminist posthumanism. So I guess, like, just to kind of contextualize why I was interested in this, I mean, I was, living in Berlin and, I'm talking with my colleagues about all these, feminist new materialist ideas and posthumanist ideas, and sort of eventually realized, hang on a second, like a lot of the people that I'm reading here and talking about with my German, friends are Australian, and it's like this weird Australian diaspora all over the world, these feminist new materialists. And I wanted to kind of find out why. And it was partly through my time in Utrecht, when I was really spending time with the gender studies community there, that I realized that there is this really long-term connection between Utrecht and a few other kind of key places and Sydney, and this kind of international network, which is peppered with all of these people from that time in Sydney. And I guess that sort of explains on some level, I don't know, it sort of seemed to map my own trajectory, but like in reverse or something. So the film is narrated by 6 participants in this history, and it situates their narratives through stories of the housing experiments that they lived in, which were the real locations for many of the political alliances that characterized the movements rather than existing institutions. And I wanted to situate the voices in the film, and I felt that rather than the usual format of biography, that I wouldn't introduce any of them by name, and instead I would get each of them to tell me about a house that they had lived in. And these group houses became the kind of protagonists of the film, because I guess, like, in this research, one of the big hypotheses that I came to, or what I came to believe, was the reason that there were such successful alliances among different activists in Sydney in different issues in the 70s and 80s was because of the shared housing movement. So all these kind of diverse people met and got involved in each other's lives through these houses, and they became the kind of organizing spaces for many activist projects that could not be located in existing institutions. And I think it's a really interesting demonstration of the feminist dictum, the personal is political. That what I learned about alliances from my research in Sydney is that it is sharing time and these intimate spaces with those who have kind of different but compatible political commitments is a really excellent way to create strong alliances. And if you want to kind of change society, you have to start at home with your intimate relationships and chosen kinships and the way that you organize domestic and care labor. So now I'll show just an excerpt from this film to give an example of one of these houses as protagonists in this history.
The house was called Lorraine, and it was a big sort of crumbling New Orleans kind of weatherboard mansion in Redfern. There was 5 or 6 of us living there at any time usually, and became a women's house really. We were a collection of artists and filmmakers, and I had an editing room there and edited a film there. There was on the first floor a huge big lounge room which had double doors that opened onto a balcony. We had many gatherings in this room. It was a time when we were very involved with feminist politics, and Carolyn Strawn, who's a filmmaker now, she lives in New York, but she was one of the Lorraine gals. So she and her partner, her then partner Alessandra Cavadini, had made some wonderful films, documentary films with Indigenous communities up in Borroloola, up in the Cape. And they'd lived up with the Aboriginal community there for about 6 months. And so when they were doing the post, some people came down. So we had the old ladies from Borroloola who came and stayed in our lounge room. So we were called the Porcupines because of our sort of crew cuts with our, our overalls and our short hair. And they sat in the lounge room with their boomerangs, and they'd make up all these songs in language, which would be like, and the Porcupines got up in the morning and made their orange juice and coffees, and then they went off to work. And
I moved into 20 Gladstone Street, Lilyfield, late in pregnancy to share with another woman who was also having a baby. We'd known each other through the Marxist Feminism Conference Committee that had taken place that year. She'd conceived by artificial insemination. She worked in women's health and so on. We both had daughters, and the girls grew up together. We shared a household for about 9 years, and then I moved out and bought an apartment, but we all still kept in touch. The girls went off to university together, and then they shared a house together for even longer than we'd shared. So they had this house for nearly 11 years, and then one of them, the one who's not my biological daughter, decided to have children conceived in the same manner in which she herself had been conceived. And so now she's had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, and we're all still really close.
I lived at Unit 5, 13 Campbell Street, Balmain. And I think in a sort of a selfish way, I needed a community. And so a few of us formed these reading groups. We were coming from different disciplines, whoever's turn it was would cook a meal and everyone would go to their place and we'd have a meal and then we'd have the readings. I saw that Elizabeth Gross was giving something on semiotics and I think certainly in her class and Moira's class, or at least what for me was so strange and different, was that when they were talking about the body, they were constantly referring to biology and all the work that both of them did on hysteria. There was a sense that you were actually talking about meat, flesh, bones, and not signs of meat, flesh, bones, but that meat itself was signing. What started to happen out of those classes is because quite a few of us were working in other departments, as I say, it might have been visual arts or anthropology or literature. And so a few of us formed these reading groups. There is a blurriness for me between what we were doing in some of those classes and what was happening in those reading groups. Also in Moira's class, part of her actual course were the reading groups. Moira was teaching Irigaray also. At the beginning there were lots of Australian translations. There were quite a few Australian translations. Obviously Paul Patton had been, Megan Morris, people like that had been in Paris as this was coming through. We were getting hold of bits of translations.
After the strike, I moved into an apartment in Paddington, which was a shared house upstairs on the corner of Oxford Street and Elizabeth Street, above some shops. The period around the strike and immediately afterward was characterised by this proliferation of reading groups. And the one that was a year-long group that read Marx's Capital in all 3 volumes, and that's the one that involved one of the academics who was a principal figure in the philosophy department split and activities leading up to the strike. That was Wal Suchting, who had taught the course on Marxism and was the supervisor of the 2 women who proposed the feminism course, Jean Kurthwes and Liz Jacker. And this was part of the self-managed democratic student atmosphere of that whole period and the strike itself. We had earlier meetings indeed in other apartments, but then it settled down to regular meetings in this house in Paddington.
I eventually moved to a place in Australia Street, Camperdown. It was a great house because of the people that were there. Some of us were feminists and we'd have meetings there in the living room. And there used to be gay liberation meetings. People from the house were all going to demos here and demos there, or go spray painting billboards and getting arrested. One of the women was a builder's laborer. And she said, "You're strong enough, you could be a builder's laborer. Come on, you can come down to the office and sign up," because they're trying to encourage more women into the industry. On the Katie's job, the first job I had as a builder's laborer, there were 2 carpenters, and I worked with one of them okay, but there was another one that refused to work with me. So I had to eventually complain to the foreman, and the foreman had a little talk to him. So from then on, he just with gritted teeth asked me to do things. But then as he could see I could do the work and that I was kind of interesting, I talked a lot about I talked about feminism, I talked about my beliefs, etc. And a few months later, he was going to another job and he asked the foreman if he could take me with him. At Australia Street, there was a laundry there that I could turn into another dark room, which I did, and continued my photography. And also in the house, there was a woman who wanted to do a 16 mil workshop that was being offered by the Sydney Filmmakers Co-op. Then I got really involved in the co-op, and I became a projectionist, and I had access to all the films at the co-op. So at lunchtime, I used to take a projector from the co-op and films, and I would take them to the building site and I would show films, like a lot about the working class. And there were some women's, films about women's issues, all social issue films. I mean, that's my interest, so yeah.
Yeah, so where To Become Two was concerned with tracing a number of these specific and interconnected genealogies that were part of my own feminist formation, investigating these transgenerational links among networks and groupings in Australia and Europe that had shaped my political engagement and feminist practice up until that point. Following To Become Two, I began a new research project called Alliances, and in it, I'm attempting to broaden my knowledge of genealogies of feminist and related practices that I have no prior connection to, and to facilitate greater pluralist solidarity among different activist groupings that, broadly have compatible objectives. And I think that in this worldwide political moment that we're in, solidarity among the anti-capitalist left, decolonial First Nations, LGBTQIA+, anti-racist and environmental activists and trade unions is more urgent than ever. And I feel compelled to learn about feminist genealogies that are unknown to me in an attempt to explore the conditions for greater solidarity across feminisms. And that's motivated by the observation that while there was a significant diversity amongst those who took part in the To Become Two research, because of the nature of the project and its inquiry related to my own feminist formation, I was engaging with people who were already interested in those histories, who were already committed to them, and thus who came from somewhat similar contexts to myself. And so towards this this idea of expanding my knowledge and my connections, I thought I would actually start in Paris and expand on the research that I had done into this group, Psychanalyse Politique, in the To Become Two project, into a sort of broader engagement with the politics of the French women's liberation movement. And I made a film in Paris in 2018 called Alliances, which was concerned with race relations and feminism. And it asked how the 50th anniversary of May 1968 that year would be an important moment to make visible the historical points of entanglement between the decolonial and feminist movements in Paris. That year, the dominant commemoration of May 68 was really problematic. The university executives were kind of using the legacy of the May 68 protests as a kind of cultural capital, but at the same time repressing huge student protests that year. So it was like totally contradictory. And there was also a forgetting of the women's movement in general in the commemoration of May 68, or kind of token inclusions of it. And the women's movement itself was a kind of reaction to the experience of women taking part in the May 68, the general May 68 movement, and its kind of hypocrisy there. And there were also a forgetting of links with the decolonial movements in Northern Africa as well. And at the same time, feminism and decolonial politics in France, there are many kind of generalizing narratives that the women, about the women's liberation movement, and a lot of division between decolonial feminists and white feminists. And I wanted to show that ethnicity and race had always been a part of the women's movement, and to find stories of alliances among feminists and decolonial activists that could serve as examples as sources of knowledge about how to tackle the divisions today and to generate alliances now. So I invited 10 committed feminists in the city of Paris from different positions and backgrounds and professions. And I brought them together to explore the legacy of the women's liberation movement from each of their perspectives. And we worked over several months together. First, each had an encounter with a feminist forebear, or aîné féministe is what was called in French, and who became her kind of personal link to May 1968, and which brought new knowledge of, for example, participation of groups like La Coordination des Femmes Noires, or the Coordination of Black Women within the women's liberation movement in France. And and so there were all these kind of like, minor genealogies that came out of that research into, how did each of these contributors to the project relate to that history. And I think it's important to note that 2 African French women who were part of this project of mine said that they had no link to May 1968. And that was also a really important perspective. So the way that I organized it was that I decided on pairs in the group. I sort of tried to match people up who I thought were kind of, quite different from each other, but had some kind of resonance where I thought that they would, I guess it was a kind of attempt at guessing where affidamento might arise, let's say. And I set them up on blind dates, and they worked then in these pairings to develop propositions for alliances amongst themselves. So, how could each person support the work of the other, and that kind of thing. And then we met for a workshop all together to develop this public salon, which formed part of the Centre Pompidou's commemorative program in May that year. And together, the feminist forebears and the 10 answers to the question of what is the legacy of May 68 was not, it didn't form a survey answer to that question, but rather a kind of very personal and situated way to show the complexity of the history and to point out the work on race politics and feminism that still needs to be done, of course. And I spent time with many of them, of these people in the group, to construct these double biographies, the story of the relationship between each contributor and her feminist forebear. And I chose to focus in the film on 2 of these double biographies because I felt like they said the most about race politics in feminism in France. And they are the relationship between Karima El Kharaz, who's a Moroccan-French playwright and stage director, and her feminist forebear, Jati Dombori, who's also a playwright and novelist originally from Guadeloupe, who was part of the Coordination des Femmes Noires. And then the other double biography that the film explores is between Claire Finch, an American gender studies PhD student at Paris 8, and her feminist forebear, Hélène Sixou, who was, of course, a very important figure in the French women's liberation movement and the founder of the first Women's Studies Center at Paris 8, where Claire was studying. And then the film is kind of a lot about the relationship that develops between Claire and Karima. So it's about this kind of, relationship between them, but then also the relationship to their feminist forebears. So it was interesting that some of the feminists in the group who identified as Black engaged with genealogies that had nothing to do with May 1968, and thus the framing of the project needed to be adapted. So, for example, Aya Sissoko, a famous boxer and writer, she said that her feminist forebear was her mother, who was a working class migrant from Mali, and never had any kind of access to or connection to the May 68 women's liberation movement. That was such an important revelation, of course, that I had to change the shape of the project in some way. So I think that was probably one of the most important things I learned from this project about alliances, is that you have to be ready to change the shape of your project. And another really important discovery with this group was that everyone who took part in it confirmed the absolute centrality of relational process to their feminism. So, they were all from really different positionalities and different feminist genealogies. And yet each of them could say that that something like affidamento was really at the heart of their feminism. And so, following this project, I was really tempted to think of affidamento as, and this practice of relations as kind of universal to all feminist genealogies. And of course, there must be limits to that, but I said I was tempted to think that. So following this project in Paris, I turned my attention to where I came from. I sort of thought, well, here I am kind of facilitating this project in a place that I don't come from. And I'm, I think that gave me a certain advantage, being an outsider. But I thought, in a way, if I were to really kind of make a contribution, that I should actually make some work about alliances between First Nations and non-Indigenous feminists in Australia. And, and look, feminism for me has always just been a frame for a politics of difference. It's never been an identity politics. I don't, I chose to work on feminism because it was a frame through which I could work on a politics of difference. And, I began, and I think that because, I think that it's almost impossible to undertake feminism in Australia at the moment as a frame. It's like, until, First Nations people are, in a better position in this society, that it's a kind of redundant frame. And actually, I'd like to quote Keeanga Yamada Taylor, who's a African American feminist theorist. If Black women are free, then everyone would be free, as this would end the systems of oppression that keep them unfree. And so I think that, I really believe that my liberty actually rests on the liberty of the most oppressed as well. So it's not a kind of, I think it's really misguided to think that there's no kind of, that in struggling with someone else's struggle, that it of course relates to your own liberty as well. And I think that's why I felt like I have to kind of, I guess, enter into something really rather difficult and go back to the place where I came from and try to do something meaningful with that. And and I think that in Australia, because of the current the level of the oppression of First Nations people here, everyone with a public voice is directly or indirectly profiting from colonialism. And so I had to kind of grapple with that condition returning to Australia. Like, here I am being an artist and in some way profiting from colonialism in that position. And I took on this professorship at the art school in Canberra. And I sort of realized that that the whole structure of artistic authorship, this like solo artist author, is so deeply problematic in this context. It's, because of its kind of modernist history, that I actually thought I have to just step back. I have to unlearn. I have to listen and do something useful and be of service. And so I spent quite a bit of time just working on kind of like activism within the university and trying to create space for First Nations artists and First Nations professors and First Nations students, and put my energy into that for quite some time. That process, I think, was really kind of guided by my colleague there, Brenda Croft, who is a really amazing Australian artist of Gurindji Mudbara peoples, and also Anglo-Australian, Chinese, German, and Irish heritage. She always likes to mention all of her heritage. And together with her, I worked on quite a bit of this institutional activism. And then we did start to sort of collaborate together, and that seemed to me to be the most appropriate way forward. It's like, well, if I'm going to continue working on my politics, I have to kind of appreciate that the way that I had been deconstructing my authorship in a project like To Become Two and showing its contingency upon other voices and decentering it, and that was just not enough in this context, like that actually I had to move towards co-authorship if I was really going to, that's the only appropriate way to do it. And building that relationship with Brenda was very important in figuring out how that might be possible. And also engaging with place. So this piece here is a photograph by Brenda Croft of Auntie Matilda House, who's a very important Ngunnawal and Ngambri elder. And I guess an engagement with the elders of the place where I was a really important learning curve. And so that was, it was also really amazing in my conversations with Auntie Matilda, that she affirmed that my understanding of a politics of difference and some of these European feminist ideas that I had around affidamento, for example, that she actually agreed that the practice of relations is really foundational to an alliance between First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians as well. And I thought that was amazing that she knew what I was talking about there. And actually the ideas were really compatible, and the practice that she was undertaking with me as well, and between Brenda and I, and this kind of commitment that we were building to one another was really like the prerequisite for being able to actually do anything. So I think, and then I just would briefly say that, I then took on the role of, I think it's really interesting to think about the role of service actually in this situation, where rather than being the kind of artist protagonist, I took on the role of, being somebody who facilitated a project led by others. And I'll just say a limited amount about it because it isn't really mine to display. But there, I was assisting Brenda with this project that she was leading around a really fascinating practice of walking that First Nations people have undertaken. It's ancient, this kind of walking on country, but also walking as an act of protest as well, and some really fascinating histories around that. And while I was assisting with that work, and I developed this idea that actually to create alliances in this context, the practice was to walk with, to literally walk alongside and be led, and to listen in that practice. So to kind of submit yourself to an experience guided by knowledge holders, and to kind of wait until you had earned enough trust to be given a story and to be guided through country. And so I think, so I'm just coughing. So I think that it's not enough to deconstruct authorship and then occupy the position of the artist in this endeavor. You have to reconsider your position and your power entirely. And an even more radical engagement in the practice of relationships is required, where this shift towards co-authorship must be earned through trust that is built through walking with, through listening, and through service. And it will take some time until I've built the relationships necessary in order to collaboratively create that project that explores a history of alliances between First Nations and non-Indigenous feminists in Australia. And I would say that the biggest obstacle at the moment that I grapple with in this project is distance. because I moved to Melbourne at the beginning of the pandemic. And then there's been this kind of, prevention of movement and so on that has been very strict here. And I've been unable to kind of continue building the relationship with Auntie Matilda and Brenda to some extent. Auntie Matilda doesn't use the internet. So it's this kind of, it's difficult to put your energy into building relationships also when, because my livelihood relies on this kind of capitalist system of productivity and, producing things within a certain time frame. And so, so the challenge with alliances, I think, is to really make the time and to put energy into the very accessible and low-tech and intimate space of your personal relationships and allow them to shape who you are and what you do. And then I just thought I would end by saying that alongside this kind of necessarily very slow work of unlearning and undoing of my artistic subjectivity in this alliances project, I've also been working on a project called Kin, which explores the legacy of women's and gay and lesbian liberation movements in the kinship practices of queer families in the present. And first I made a film called Bliss Techniques, which presented a kind of a toolkit for feminist queer sexual pleasure and reproduction. And at the moment I'm working on a 4-channel film, animation and vinyl text installation about a group called the Jewish Adelaide Lesbian Feminists, otherwise known as JAFL. And they're kind of a queer family of 3 generations now in Adelaide, Australia, who have adapted, sorry, I've just got a tickle in my throat. They've adapted Jewish rituals to be feminist, Marxist, LGBTQIA+ inclusive, and they've done that as a way of kind of creating this transgenerational belonging and meaning. And the project is concerned with how the practice of relationships as the basis for liberation politics can create new kinship structures and feminist queer cultures that are long-lasting. And the practices of JAFL are one example of how to create a transgenerational sense of belonging to an ongoing peaceful revolution of our most fundamental relational structures. So one part of the work is a kind of storytelling ritual that I devised together with JAFL, which was filmed and then edited, adapting the ritual of Shabbat, or the Jewish Day of Rest, into a ritual for gathering and sharing stories about the group's kinship practices. And then there's like a whole lot of really incredible archival material that I'm working with. And I thought I would just share a little clip with you from of one of their rituals for the festival of Passover. So it's just a kind of short clip of, I guess if, it's without the context of the rest of the film, it might be a little hard if you're not familiar with Jewish rituals to kind of pinpoint all the differences in what they're doing there. But if you listen carefully, I think you can hear the kind of the feminist Marxist kind of shift that they've made in the way that they practice these rituals. So I'll just share that with you.
Sarah and Rebecca, Rachel and Leah, Esther and Dinah, Shifra and Hua, Ruth and Deborah, we offer a blessing.
Amen.
Now we're up to the plays.
Blessing on your head, muzzle toe, muzzle toe.
Yeah. Sorry, we're into movies now.
Okay.
I love that song.
So everyone's got a bit of something in their
Yes, that's right.
stuff.
Yes.
Okay. Do a bit of.
Oh, yeah.
And after this, we'll clear the.
And have dinner.
Small plates.
The
small
bags.
plates. Yeah. And so we've got to have one in that's COVID and, should we say a plague of sexual harassment and unchanged relations between unchanged power relations.
Yes.
We could have that as a. We'll make them up, shall we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can think of a few.
Yeah. Plagues of mice.
Yes,
Yes,
mice.
plagues of mice.
Oh my God, I'm
Okay,
so
let's have men next. Men. Mice and men.
Mice and
men. Mice and men.
It's a good title for something. Okay.
Oh, fruit flies.
And COVID.
Bad driving. What are you doing, Karen? You're making them up.
Lots of people are dying.
Yeah, sure.
What do
Porsche.
No, I recently did a test driving test.
Oh, you did?
And how did you go?
Clearly mastered.
Ignorance. These plagues are in the past, but today's world holds plagues as well. Let us spill drops of wine as we recite these 10 new plagues. Apathy in the face of evil.
Yes.
Brutal torture of the helpless.
Yes.
Cruel mockery of the old and the weak.
Yeah.
I think that's ageism. Despair of human goodness.
Yes.
Envy of the joy of others.
Yes.
Falsehood and deception corroding our faith. Greedy theft of Earth's resources.
Yes.
Hatred of learning and culture.
Yes.
Instigation of war and aggression.
Yes.
Justice delayed. Justice denied. Justice mocked. Shekinah softens our hearts and the hearts of our enemies. Help us to dream new paths to freedom, so that the next sea opening is not also a drowning, so that our singing is never again their wailing, so that our freedom leaves no one orphaned, childless, gasping for air.
So yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Wow, thank you so much. Such a great talk. Let's meet again in a couple of minutes. So at 9:15 I will send the link as said before. And thank you, Alex. See you soon.
Thanks, bye.